Hi, everyone. This week, we're going to be focusing on the second part of our nervous system series, where we're going to be taking a look at the other half of our central nervous system. Last week, we finished off looking at the brain, and today we're going to start off moving into the spinal cord. We'll then move into looking at the peripheral nervous system division, where we focus on the spinal nerves, which are extensions of the spinal cord, and then the cranial nerves, which are the peripheral extensions of the brain. We'll finish our time together then looking at how our body regulates all of the autonomic processes through the autonomic nervous system, both through our sympathetic and parasympathetic pathways. So just to review where we left off last week, we had taken a look at the brain, and you recall that the brain is made up of four main regions. We have the diencephalon here, right at the central core, and the diencephalon is made up of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, as well as the pineal gland. Moving inferiorly from the diencephalon, we have the brainstem, and the brainstem is made up of the midbrain, most superiorly, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And recall the medulla was the region that was responsible for a lot of those basic life support functions, right? Our respiratory center and cardiovascular centers. Now, posterior to the pons, we have the cerebellum, which is responsible for coordination of muscle movements and fine motor skills. And then finally, we finished off looking at the cerebrum, the different lobes that make it up, and the various functions of each of those lobes. If you recall that the lobes of the cerebrum are all named according to the cranial bones that lay over top of them. And so here anteriorly, we have the frontal lobe, which is responsible for motor. The parietal lobes posterior to that are responsible for sensation. The temporal lobe here, which is divided from the parietal and from the frontal by the lateral cerebral sulcus, is responsible for sense of hearing. And then lastly, the occipital lobe, which is responsible for our sense of vision. And now surrounding the cerebrum, as well as into the spinal cord, we have three layers of protective meninges. And the meninges run deep to superficial, the pia mater, which connects directly to the organ itself, the arachnoid mater, which you can see here highlighted in purple, and then the most superficial of them, the dura mater. Now today we're going to look at the differences between the dura mater and compare those in the spinal region compared to the cranial region. Because remember last week, we talked about how in the cranial region, the dura mater is connected directly to the cranial bones. So there's no epidural space outside of the dura mater to add any extra cushion for our brain. Within the spinal cord, we have the epidural space, which is full of adipose tissue and acts to protect the spinal cord further. Now, between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, we have what's known as the subarachnoid space. And within the subarachnoid space, this is where our cerebral spinal fluid circulates to bathe the entire brain as well as spinal cord. And the regions where the cerebral spinal fluid is produced are within deeper regions of the brain, specifically within these chambers known as ventricles. Now here you can see from this perspective, we have lateral ventricles here, which make up our first and second ventricles. Looking from a superior perspective, you can see them a little bit better here. Ultimately, from the first and second lateral ventricles, cerebral spinal fluid can circulate into the third ventricle, and ultimately from the third ventricle can also circulate to the fourth ventricle. Now it's important to note that cerebral spinal fluid is produced in each of these ventricles, and the specific tissue that's responsible for producing them is known as the choroid plexus. And so here you can see in this diagram, the choroid plexus of the lateral ventricles has been identified, the choroid plexus of the third ventricle, and finally the fourth ventricle. And the choroid plexus is made up of specific neuroglia cells that we didn't talk about last week. Remember, the neuroglia are the helpers. These neuroglia are known as ependymal cells. And the ependymal cells are responsible for producing the cerebral spinal fluid that is going to act to bathe and protect our central nervous system. And so within these deep ventricles of the brain, the cerebral spinal fluid is produced by the choroid plexus, and the choroid plexus is made up of those ependymal cells. So ultimately, the ependymal cells produce that cerebral spinal fluid, and it can circulate from lateral ventricles to the third, finally to the fourth. Now take a look here at this cross section, and let's take a look here and blow this image up. Here you are looking at the subarachnoid space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. Now you can see here that there is a connection between the fourth ventricle and the subarachnoid space, which can then allow for cerebrospinal fluid to circulate around the brain. As we're going to see today, these meninges that surround the brain also continue and surround the spinal cord. And so ultimately, this subarachnoid space surrounds the entire central nervous system, both brain and spinal cord. So the cerebrospinal fluid can circulate around the exterior portion of the central nervous system through this subarachnoid space, and can also then circulate through the interior of the brain through the ventricles, where the cerebrospinal fluid is produced. And then that continues into a structure known as the central canal. And the central canal runs down the entire length of the spinal cord, as we will see. And this is how the central nervous system is also protected internally. Now we're going to move on from looking at where the brainstem exits the cranium, which is known as the foramen magnum, that larger opening in the base of the occipital bone. And we are now going to move into looking how the brainstem then becomes the spinal cord. Now, as this terminal portion of the brainstem, known as the medulla oblongata, passes through the foramen magnum of the occipital bone, it then becomes the spinal cord. And the spinal cord runs from the foramen magnum all the way down inferiorly until about the level of L2. And you might be thinking, okay, well, I know we have 5 lumbar vertebrae, so why is the spinal cord only running down to about L2? Well, from the foramen magnum all the way down to L2, the spinal cord has the structure that we know as a cord, right, where everything is arranged in specific tracks. As we move past that level of L2, you may notice that all of a sudden the spinal cord then splits off into a number of terminal nerve endings. That region here is known as the cauda equina. Now, the spinal cord runs directly through the vertebral canal. If you think back to our skeletal anatomy, the vertebral foramen were those large openings within the vertebrae. And when we stack all of the vertebrae on top of one another, the spinal cord can then run directly through all of those openings. So there are a number of ways in which we protect the spinal cord. The vertebrae offer bony protection. Recall that we also have an epidural space outside of the dura mater. And that epidural space that you can see here almost looking hollow is actually filled with adipose tissue. And so the adipose tissue helps to cushion the spinal cord within the vertebral canal. Now, similarly to the cranial region, where we had cranial meninges, we also have spinal meninges that surround the spinal cord, run down the entire length of it. And then lastly, we have protection from the cerebral spinal fluid. So not only does the cerebral spinal fluid bathe the external aspect of the spinal cord through that subarachnoid space, but it also bathes the internal aspect of the spinal cord down through that central canal. Now, ultimately, the spinal cord is acting as that major relay center. Remember, we have afferent information that's coming out from the periphery, whether it's from your lower extremities, your upper extremities, head and neck, or even any of your trunk. Any of the sensory information is going to be sent through specific sensory neurons, known as afferent neurons, that are going to arrive at the spinal cord. Now, when we looked at reflexes last week, we saw how monosynaptic reflexes simply connected the sensory neuron directly to a motor neuron, and there was a quick loop that happened in the spinal cord. So in some instances, the spinal cord actually acts as a processing center. For any other sensory information that requires further processing by our brain, the sensory information is going to be sent up through the ascending tracts of the spinal cord, where ultimately then it will be sent to specific regions of the brain where we will process that information. All of this connection here through the spinal cord and within the brain is through interneurons. Recall the afferent neurons are the sensory components of the peripheral nervous system, and the efferent are the motor components of the peripheral nervous system. Any neurons connecting within the central nervous system, either spinal cord or within the brain, those are all interneurons. And so ultimately, the sensory information is going to have to then be sent up to the brain through the interneurons that are going to arrive at the brain, processing occurs, and some sort of response will take place. Now, let's just use a simple example where we felt a spider on our hand and we decided we wanted to swat that spider off. So that motor information is going to be sent from the frontal lobe of the brain through the descending tracts of the spinal cord to then exit through specific efferent motor neurons that will innervate the muscles that we want to activate. So the spinal cord is ultimately acting as that main connecting organ of the central nervous system, bringing in that sensory information to the brain and then sending out the outgoing motor information. Now here we've taken a cross section of the spinal cord. And so let's just say from this level here within the thoracic spine, we have taken the cross section directly here horizontally, and now we're going to be looking from a superior to an inferior perspective. Now remember, within the central nervous system, our neurons are arranged into white matter and gray matter. In the brain, we saw the gray matter on the periphery of the brain as the cerebral cortex, and then the white matter was deeper, which formed the subcortical region. Here in the spinal cord, it's flipped. The gray matter is located internally within the spinal cord in this H-shaped pattern, and the white matter surrounds the gray matter in the spinal cord. So if you recall, the white matter is made up of myelinated axons, and then the gray matter is made up of everything else. So we have unmyelinated axons, cell bodies, dendrites, terminal branches. Any other part of the neuron is found here within the gray matter. Ultimately, within that central portion of the gray matter, this is where we have that central canal. And the central canal runs directly in the middle of the spinal cord all the way through the entire length. Now, you do not need to know the specific names of all of these tracks. What I'm showing you here is the way in which these sensory and motor tracks are arranged. So remember, the white matter is all myelinated axons, right? What are the axons? The regions of the neuron where we're just transmitting those action potentials, those signals. So when we have a sensory signal that needs to be sent up to the brain, it's going to be sent through these blue ascending pathways. Those are the sensory pathways. Information is moving from inferior to superior, right? Going up to the brain to be processed. And ultimately the motor, which you can see highlighted in red, emphasized on this side of the diagram, the motor pathways are known as descending pathways. Okay, and the descending tracks here carry all of those specific motor signals that are then going to be sent out to the effectors of the body. Now, it's very important then when looking at a cross section of the spinal cord that you can determine which is the anterior portion and which is the posterior portion, because sensory and motor information are dealt with in these different regions. Now, when you look at a cross section of the spinal cord, you'll notice here that we have an anterior median fissure. Okay, a fissure, remember, is a deep groove. This anterior median fissure helps you identify the anterior or ventral surface of the spinal cord from the posterior or dorsal surface of the spinal cord. And this is important because in the dorsal region, this is where the spinal cord receives the sensory information. So any of those afferent signals that are coming in from the periphery of the body, they are ultimately going to arrive at the posterior or dorsal aspect of the spinal cord at a region known as the dorsal horn. In contrast, from the ventral portion here, from the ventral horn, this is where the motor or efferent information is going to be sent out from the spinal cord. So any of those descending pathways sent from the brain that contain motor information that we're wanting to send out to some effectors of the body, that is ultimately going to leave through the ventral horn of the spinal cord, out through the ventral root, and down through the spinal nerve until it innervates the specific structure. So the dorsal horn is responsible for receiving sensory information, and the ventral horn is responsible for sending outgoing motor information. And when we looked at the monosynaptic reflex, where that sensory neuron connected directly to the motor neuron, take a look at that image. You'll notice that the sensory information ultimately connected directly to the cell body of the motor neuron and sent that information then back out through the motor neuron. Now, we also have what are known as lateral horns, but these are only present in the thoracic spine as well as the upper region of the lumbar spine. And the lateral horns are responsible, as you can see here, for processing autonomic motor regulation. So any of the cardiac smooth muscle or any of those glands that we're going to be looking at that are automatically regulated, those motor signals are going to originate here at the lateral horns of various levels throughout the thoracic as well as lumbar spine. Now, similarly to the brain, we have the spinal meninges, okay? And you learned this last week, so you know these already. The spinal meninges are continuous with the cerebral meninges, those that surround the brain. So ultimately, the pia mater contacts the spinal cord directly. The arachnoid mater, superficial to the pia mater, and the dura mater, most superficial, is that outermost layer that provides the most protection. And similarly, between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater in the subarachnoid space, this is where we have cerebral spinal fluid bathing the external aspect of the spinal cord. So then outside of that dura mater, that is where we have this epidural space. And it's the epidural space that we have adipose tissue in to provide some sort of protection between the bone of your vertebrae, between the bony structure of your vertebrae, and the dura mater itself. So it's important for both the spinal meninges as well as cerebral meninges, as they're continuous with one another, to make sure you know the arrangement from deep to superficial or superficial to deep. So that concludes our focus on the central nervous system, looking both at the brain and the spinal cord, looking at their specific structures and how they function. We're now going to move our attention to looking at the peripheral nervous system. If you recall, the peripheral nervous system is made up of these main divisions: the somatic, which deals with our sensory as well as voluntary motor, and the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic deals with all of the automatic motor regulation. And so that could be either to our cardiac muscle, our smooth muscle, or our glandular tissue. So we're first going to start off looking at the somatic division of the peripheral nervous system, looking at both the cranial nerves that extend directly from the brain and the spinal nerves that extend directly from the spinal cord. If you recall, the somatic division contains both the sensory as well as the voluntary motor. Now, when we look at cranial nerves versus spinal nerves, you're going to see a difference in terms of what type of information they carry. With spinal nerves, they're known as mixed nerves, and so they contain both sensory and motor neurons within each spinal nerve. Within the cranial nerves, it's set up differently. Some cranial nerves contain purely sensory neurons. Other cranial nerves contain only motor neurons, and the rest of the cranial nerves are mixed, where they contain both sensory and motor neurons. And so we're going to take a look at the cranial nerves in more detail than we will the spinal nerves. We have 12 pairs of cranial nerves that ultimately are the peripheral extensions directly from the brain. We're going to be learning their names and their general function, so whether they are sensory nerves, whether they are motor nerves, or whether they are mixed, containing both sensory and motor components. And this contains everything that you need to know regarding our various cranial nerves in the body. And for each cranial nerve, you need to know which number it is, its name, and then its generalized function. And to help us remember this, I have a couple of mnemonic devices that we're going to be using. To remember the names in sequence 1 through 12, we'll use the mnemonic: on old Olympus's towering top, a friendly Viking grew vines and hops. Okay, there are other mnemonic devices. One is an old Olympus's towering top, a ferocious, vicious goat vandalized a hat was one of them. I don't find that that one flows as well, so I tend to use this one. If you come up with your own, I would love to hear that in tutorial. So that's going to help you remember the names of these cranial nerves. And then the other mnemonic device that we're going to use: some say merry money, but my brother says big brains matter most. So as we go through the 12 pairs of cranial nerves, I'm going to be going through the specific functions of each of them. Okay, for our purposes, you only need to remember whether or not that specific cranial nerve is purely sensory, purely motor, or contains both sensory and motor neurons. So cranial nerve 1 is known as our olfactory nerve. And we've talked about the olfactory nerve before, which is responsible for our sense of smell. When we looked at the skeletal system, we saw the ethmoid bone and how it had a number of small openings in its anterior surface. And that's to allow for the olfactory bulb to be able to sit there and extend nerve fibers into our nasal mucosa. And so whenever we breathe in air, the air is going to contain specific chemicals, and those chemicals are going to react with these olfactory nerve fibers, which are going to convert that chemical signal into a specific action potential that is going to then be interpreted by our brain as a specific smell. And so the olfactory nerve contains only sensory neurons. Cranial nerve number 2 is known as the optic nerve. And the optic nerve innervates our eye and is purely sensory as well, and is responsible for our sense of visual acuity. And so your ability to be able to take in that visual information and process that at the occipital lobe is because of the optic nerve, cranial nerve number 2. And so cranial nerve number 2 is also purely sensory. Now we're going to move into looking at cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6 at the same time, because the oculomotor, trochlear, as well as abducens nerves are all purely motor nerves, and they are responsible for innervating the ocular muscles. And these are specific muscles that allow us to be able to control our eye movements. So we have 3 pairs of motor cranial nerves that are responsible for being able to control those intricate eye movements. And the ocular motor nerve actually innervates, I believe, 4 of those muscles, whereas abducens as well as trochlear are specifically dedicated to one specific muscle. And so for cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6, oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens, they are all purely motor cranial nerves. Now we skipped 5, and 5 is our trigeminal nerve. And the trigeminal nerve actually has dual functions. This is the first mixed cranial nerve that we're going to be talking about. What you see here highlighted in this diagram is the sensory component of the trigeminal nerve. And the sensory component of the trigeminal nerve is responsible for sensation of our face. And you can see that the trigeminal nerve has 3 main branches that are responsible for receiving sensory information from these 3 regions of our face. Now, the motor component of the trigeminal nerve, which is not highlighted in this diagram, is responsible for activating the muscles of mastication. And so we talked about that 2 weeks ago, looking at the digestive system. Mastication is the process by which we chew our food. And so the motor neurons of the trigeminal nerve innervate the 2 muscles that help us to do that. And those are the masseter, that main muscle here at the side of your cheek, and the temporalis, which we can palpate here at the lateral aspect of our cranium, which inserts into the mandible, the lower jaw. Okay, so both of those, the masseter and the temporalis, are innervated by the trigeminal nerve through the specific motor branches that are then responsible for activating those 2 muscles of mastication. Now moving on to cranial nerve number 7. Cranial nerve 7 is the facial nerve. And if we take a look here, the facial nerve contains both. It is a mixed nerve containing both sensory and motor divisions. The sensory component of the facial nerve is responsible for taste sensation from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. And this is going to be a concept we're going to revisit next week when we take a look at our specialized senses. So the sensory component of the facial nerve innervates the anterior 2/3 of the tongue and is responsible for sending the incoming sensory information to allow us to interpret taste. The motor branch of the facial nerve is responsible for innervating our facial muscles. So the orbicularis oculi, orbicularis oris, zygomaticus, frontalis, all of those muscles that allow us to make our various facial expressions are all innervated by the motor component of the facial nerve. Cranial nerve number 8 is known as the vestibulocochlear nerve. And cranial nerve number 8 is purely sensory, receiving sensory information from our inner ear. So we'll take a look at our inner ear next week in more detail, but for now, understand that the inner ear has 2 main functions. We have the cochlea, which is responsible for our sense of hearing. And then we have the vestibular region, which is responsible for our sense of equilibrium and balance. And so the vestibulocochlear nerve is receiving information from both the vestibular as well as the cochlear portion of our inner ear, which is then transmitted to the brain to help us to maintain equilibrium as well as to allow us to be able to hear. Cranial nerve number 9 is the glossopharyngeal nerve. And the glossopharyngeal is a mixed nerve. It has dual functions. The sensory components allow us to be able to sense taste on the posterior third of the tongue. So whereas the taste sensation from the anterior 2/3 was regulated by the sensory component of the facial nerve, the taste sensation on the posterior third of the tongue is regulated by the sensory division of the glossopharyngeal nerve. Now, the motor component of the glossopharyngeal nerve is responsible for innervating our pharyngeal musculature. So remember, our pharynx is our throat. The pharyngeal muscles allow us to be able to swallow. Cranial nerve number 10 is the vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve also contains both sensory and motor neurons. The sensory divisions receive information from our digestive and respiratory organs in the thorax and abdominal cavity, but is also responsible for our gag reflex. And the motor division of the vagus nerve works alongside the parasympathetic nervous system to be able to regulate the smooth muscle that makes up our digestive system. Cranial nerve 11 is the accessory nerve, and the accessory nerve innervates the sternocleidomastoid muscle as well as the trapezius, allowing us to control head and neck movements. And the hypoglossal nerve, which is cranial nerve number 12, is a motor nerve, which contains only motor neurons that innervate the tongue and allow for us to be able to control movements of the tongue, such as when we're eating and trying to create that food bolus, or when we're talking. And so in summary, we have the 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and we need to make sure we know both the names as well as their generalized functions. So whether their function is sensory, motor, or mixed, both motor and sensory. Next week, when we look at the specialized senses, we're going to revisit some of these functions, and then you will be responsible for knowing those specific functions going forward. Now, the spinal nerves we are going to be covering in a lot less detail. There are many spinal nerves that all innervate different areas of the body. And remember, as I mentioned, the spinal nerves are all mixed nerves. And that means that they contain both sensory as well as motor information, which means that each spinal nerve contains sensory neurons that are coming into the spinal cord and contains motor neurons, which are outgoing from the spinal cord. Now, there are 31 different pairs of spinal nerves, and the numbers line up with the number of vertebrae in each region. There is an exception here within the cervical region, where we only have 7 cervical vertebrae, but we have 8 cervical spinal nerves. And this is because of the way in which these spinal nerves exit from the vertebrae. You'll see here within the cervical region of the spinal cord that the cervical spinal nerves exit above the level for which they're named. And so the C1 spinal nerve is going to exit above the level of C1. C2 exits above the level of C2. C3 above C3, and so on. Once we get down to C7, you see C7 exits above C7, but then C8 exits below C7. Okay, so this is why we actually have 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves, whereas we only have 7 cervical vertebrae. Now, moving inferior from the cervical region, you'll notice all of the rest of the spinal nerves are all going to exit below the level for which they're named. And so T1 exits below the T1 vertebrae, T2 below the T2 vertebrae, L3 from below the level of L3. So we have 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves, we have 12 pairs of thoracic spinal nerves, 5 pairs of lumbar spinal nerves, and then 5 pairs of sacral spinal nerves, as well as 1 pair of coccygeal nerves. Now we can map both the sensory as well as the motor distribution of these various spinal nerve roots throughout the entire body. And what I've provided you with here is a dermatomal map. And dermatomes are distributions of the sensory neurons that pass through the various spinal nerves. And so clinically, we can use dermatomes as well as myotomes, the specific muscular patterns of innervation, to be able to determine if there's some issue going on at the spinal level. And so here with the dermatomes, this provides you with a map of the sensory components of those spinal nerves. And a myotome would be giving you a different mapping, showing you the different muscles that are innervated by the different nerve roots. Now, ultimately, those maps are taking a look at these individual spinal nerve roots that all extend from each level of the spine. Once those spinal nerve roots have exited, those various spinal nerve roots are capable of being able to connect with other nerve roots, which then extend throughout our body as peripheral nerves. And these are just some of the names of the peripheral nerves that extend throughout, for example, your upper extremity or into your lower extremity. And where these spinal nerves then share this information and braid together to form these peripheral nerves, these are known as plexuses. Okay, so a plexus is essentially like a web-like connection of all of the information coming from these various nerve roots, ultimately going to be sent together as one peripheral nerve to some region of the body. And so here in the cervical region, we have a plexus known as the cervical plexus, which is made up of C1 through C5 nerve roots. We have the brachial plexus, which is made up of C5 to T1 nerve roots, and ultimately those peripheral nerves extend into the upper extremity to innervate both skin and muscles. You can see within the thoracic region, we have single intercostal nerves that ultimately course through the intercostal region and innervate the muscles and skin of the trunk. And then we have the lumbar plexus made up of nerve roots L1 to L4, and the sacral plexus L4 to S4. So now we're going to move from looking at the somatic division of both cranial nerves and spinal nerves to moving over to the autonomic division. So what structures are going to be innervated by the autonomic nervous system? Right? You want to think of those effectors in the body that are going to be automatically regulated. So that would be your cardiac muscle, your smooth muscle, and your glandular tissue. So we're going to take a look at the differences between the sympathetic division, responsible for our flight or fight response, and the parasympathetic division, responsible for our rest and digest response. Now this diagram here is highlighting the differences between the sympathetic division here on the left and the parasympathetic division here on the right. Remember, the effectors, those final targets that we are trying to regulate, are those that are made up of cardiac muscle, which we only find in the heart, smooth muscle, which we find everywhere else, and our glandular tissue. Now, these two divisions are different in a number of ways. First off, the sympathetic nerve fibers originate from the thoracolumbar regions, from both the thoracic and the lumbar regions of the spinal cord. Remember those lateral horns. And ultimately, that is where the sympathetic nervous system can also be referred to as the thoracolumbar. The parasympathetic nerve fibers, in contrast, originate from the brainstem as well as the sacral region. And that's where the parasympathetic can also be referred to as the craniosacral division. Now you'll notice here that we have two dots. Those dots are representative of cell bodies. So what does this mean? If we look here along the thoracic and lumbar regions, you can see we have a cell body here in the spinal cord, and then we have another cell body within these structures known as sympathetic ganglia. Instead of just having one motor nerve that's going to be sending the signal from the spinal cord to the muscle tissue, we have a unique conduction pathway, which is made up of a two-nerve relay. And so we end up with preganglionic neurons, those that are before the ganglia, and postganglionic. Okay? And a ganglia is a region where there is an accumulation of cell bodies, so where there is some sort of synapse, some connection between the first nerve and the second nerve. And so here, the ganglia are where those synapses, those connections are going to be occurring. And so the nerve that occurs before the ganglia is known as the preganglionic, and the nerve that occurs after the ganglia is known as the postganglionic. So ultimately, the preganglionic automatic nerves you'll see here, very short in the sympathetic nervous system. And if you compare those to the preganglionic in the parasympathetic nervous system, they are much longer. In contrast, the postganglionic and the sympathetic are long compared to the pre. And in the parasympathetic division, we have very short post compared to the very long pre. Ultimately, the preganglionic nerves are connecting directly from the central nervous system out towards the postganglionic neuron. And then ultimately, the postganglionic nerves are going to be then connecting to the effector, whether it's cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glandular tissue. So recall here where we have those ganglia occurring, those are those regions where we have synapses between the preganglionic and the postganglionic. Okay, we referred to this previously as simply just a synapse. The synapse refers to the connection made. The ganglia is more of an anatomical structure, which results because where these cell bodies are all clustered together is actually a very bulbous portion of the anatomy, right? If you think about the anatomy of a neuron, the nerve cell, the cell body is dilated compared to the rest of the very skinny axon and terminal branches. And so where we have all these cell bodies accumulating here, we refer to them anatomically as ganglia. The preganglionic nerves in the sympathetic division are very short compared to the very long postganglionic nerves. And the way in which we communicate signals here from the pre to the post is through specific neurotransmitters. For both the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter that is utilized to be able to convey the signal from your first neuron to the second neuron, from the pre to the post. So at this site here, acetylcholine will be the neurotransmitter that is utilized. Similarly, looking at the parasympathetic division, acetylcholine will also be the neurotransmitter that is going to be transmitting the signal from the pre to the post. Okay, so no differences between the two divisions in that case. When we take a look, though, at the postganglionic nerves, the postganglionic nerves in the sympathetic division are ultimately going to release norepinephrine onto those target effectors. And in contrast, the parasympathetic, which is known as our rest and digest division, those postganglionic nerves are going to release acetylcholine onto the target tissues. Now remember, all of these effectors, whether it's cardiac muscle in the heart, smooth muscle throughout the body, or the glandular tissue, are going to receive dual innervation from both the parasympathetic as well as the sympathetic nervous system. It's important to then understand that the sympathetic is going to have certain impacts on these tissues, and the parasympathetic will have the opposite effect on these tissues. Let's take a look at one that we've already talked about, the heart. When the cardiac muscle tissue has norepinephrine dumped on it by the postganglionic sympathetic nerve fibers, that is going to cause the heart rate to speed up, right? So think about that. Sympathetic nervous system stimulating the heart, what's going to happen? Heart rate increases. Now, in contrast, when the parasympathetic postganglionic nerve fibers release acetylcholine on the cardiac muscle tissue, acetylcholine is going to cause the heart rate to slow down. And one way that you can usually go through this is think, okay, for the different tissues, if I'm stressed out, what's going to likely happen to that tissue? Or in a stressful situation, what are my body's needs going to be? And so let's take a look at some of these others. With the parasympathetic division, remember, it's focused on rest and digest. So any of these effectors that are responsible for helping us digest food, those are going to be stimulated by the parasympathetic division. So when acetylcholine is released onto any of your digestive organs, you're going to see increases in digestion. Vice versa, if the sympathetic were to stimulate your digestion, when you're stressed out, your digestive processes are going to slow down. Looking at, say, our airways, if you're trying to run away from a bear that's attacking you, you're going to need a lot of oxygen to supply all those tissues, right? And so your bronchioles are going to dilate to help you take more air in. So that is the sympathetic impact on your respiratory system. Whereas the parasympathetic, because you won't need as much oxygen because you're just relaxing on a beach somewhere, parasympathetic is going to cause those bronchioles to constrict. Okay, so you can see that the way in which the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions are going to impact these tissues are going to be opposites of one another. Another example here, dilation of pupils under sympathetic regulation, right? You're wanting to take in more visual information. And then when you're resting and digesting, well, your pupils will then constrict again because you don't need to take in as much visual information. Now, in order to help you remember some of the various ways in which these effectors are going to be regulated, I've created a list of your 5 increases and your 3 decreases that are going to occur under parasympathetic activation. And so if these functions are going to increase under parasympathetic activation, what do you think is going to happen to these 5 under sympathetic activation? They're going to be the opposite. They're going to decrease, okay? So if you remember the 5 increases and the 3 decreases under parasympathetic activation, you can just flip it for sympathetic activation, and which will help you remember in both cases what's happening here. All right, so let's take a look. First at the 5 increases, okay? I couldn't come up with a better acronym. If you can, please let me know. So SLUD stands for salivation, lacrimation, urination, digestion, and defecation. So think rest and digest. So in terms of digestion, we're looking at salivation, urination, and defecation during rest, as well as digestion. So all processes involved and linked to digestion. So it would make sense when the parasympathetic rest and digest division is active, salivation, urination, digestion, defecation will all increase. Okay, so the only one there that's not as intuitive would be lacrimation, which is tear production. Now, in contrast, when the parasympathetic nervous system is active, such as when you're resting and digesting, these following functions would all decrease. And so you would see a decrease in your heart rate, a decrease in your diameter of your airways, because we don't need as much oxygen getting into our tissues, and decrease diameter, which is known as constriction of the pupils, all right, because you don't need to take in as much visual information. Now flip that, during sympathetic activation, you're going to see these 3 increase. And so ultimately, during sympathetic, you're stressed, okay, your flight or fight response is kicked in, you're going to see your heart rate increase, your airways are going to bronchodilate to let in more oxygen, and then also your pupils are going to dilate to be able to take in more visual information. Okay, so this is what you're responsible for in ensuring that you know the various functions that will increase and decrease under parasympathetic activation, and then be able to flip it 5 decreases and 3 increases if it were the sympathetic division that were active. Okay, and that brings us to the end of part 2 of the nervous system. So at this point, we have overviewed both the central nervous system as well as the peripheral nervous system. And then next week, we're going to take a look at the somatic sensory division, where we take a look at our 5 main senses. So we'll start off looking with touch, more generalized sensation, and then move into our specialized sense organs, looking at our sense of sight, sense of taste, sense of smell, and sense of hearing. So if you have any questions in the meantime, please reach out and let me know. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you all in tutorial. Take care.